last time I felt truly comfortable in my own skin was the day before we moved to Hollow Pine. My husband, Daniel, and I had been chasing stability for years, and when he found a small publishing job that let him work from anywhere, it seemed like fate. I had just landed a position at a quaint little clinic outside town, finally trading years of travel nursing for a chance to settle down. Hollow Pine wasn't on our radar until we stumbled upon a listing. A charming Victorian home at a fraction of what it should have cost. I was enchanted. Daniel, more practical, wasn't so sure. "Why is it so cheap?" he'd asked. "Old houses come with old problems." But my excitement wore him down. I wanted this. When we arrived, the town felt like stepping into a postcard. Quiet, picturesque streets, small shops with hand-painted signs, residents who waved as they walked their dogs or watered flowers on wraparound porches. A heavy canopy of pine trees loomed on the outskirts, casting deep shadows over everything. The house itself was nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by towering evergreens. Its faded yellow exterior and ivy-covered walls had a storybook charm that called to me. "This place has character," Daniel muttered as we unloaded the moving truck. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long, crooked shadows across the property, I caught him shivering. "It's just cold," he said, brushing it off. We spent the day unpacking, and by nightfall, our living room was a maze of cardboard boxes. A single floor lamp lit the space, its glow feeble against the high ceilings. Exhausted, we collapsed onto our mismatched couch. Daniel leaned back, staring at the cracked plaster overhead. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" "Weird how?" "Just empty." I shrugged. "It's a fresh start. Give it time." A loud knock startled us both. Daniel groaned and got up, muttering something about solicitors. When he opened the door, I heard an unfamiliar voice, raspy, like dry leaves scraping pavement. "Good evening, neighbor." The man at the door was in his late 70s, maybe older, with deep-set eyes and skin that seemed stretched too thin over his bones. He wore a long coat, black as tar, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast half his face in shadow. "I'm Walter," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome to Hollow Pine. My wife, Mabel, and I live next door. We like to greet new neighbors properly." Daniel hesitated before shaking his hand. Walter's grip lingered too long, his fingers like brittle twigs. "Thanks, Walter," Daniel said, trying to sound polite. "We're still settling in, but it's nice to meet you." Walter nodded, his gaze darting past Daniel into the house. "Hollow Pine is special. Quiet, safe. You'll find we're all like family here." Daniel smiled awkwardly. "Good to know." Walter's lips curled into something between a grin and a grimace. "Our doors are always open. If you need anything, day or night, just come by. No need to knock." Before Daniel could respond, Walter turned and walked away, his coat billowing behind him like smoke. I came to the door, catching the last glimpse of him disappearing into the shadows. "Friendly guy," Daniel said, closing the door. I didn't respond. Something about Walter unnerved me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. That night, I woke to the sound of a door slamming. My heart raced as I nudged Daniel awake. "Did you hear that?" he groaned, rolling over. "It's an old house. Things creak." But it wasn't a creak. It was deliberate. The heavy thud of a door being forced shut. I crept downstairs, every step on the wooden staircase groaning under my weight. The living room was empty, the boxes undisturbed. In the foyer, the front door stood closed, the deadbolt in place. I shook the knob. Locked. Daniel found me there, arms crossed, his hair disheveled. "See? Nothing." I nodded, but the unease lingered. The next few nights followed the same pattern. Just after midnight, a door slammed. Each time I'd search the house, find nothing, and return to bed more exhausted than before. Daniel insisted it was the wind or the house settling, but on the fourth night, I noticed something chilling. The deadbolt wasn't working. It looked locked but didn't actually latch. The door could be pushed open from the outside without resistance. I didn't tell Daniel. Instead, I promised to sleep on the couch that night to keep an eye on things. I armed myself with a kitchen knife and positioned the couch to face the foyer. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wood. Around 2 a.m., I heard the doorknob jiggle. My heart stopped. I watched, frozen, as the door slowly swung open. Beyond the threshold, the darkness outside felt alive, pressing in like a physical force. Then I saw it. A hand, pale and elongated, reaching into the room. Its fingers were impossibly long, the joints twisted in unnatural angles. Dark veins pulsed under translucent skin, and the nails were jagged, blackened. The hand paused, gripping the edge of the door. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it slammed the door shut. My paralysis broke, and I stumbled back, clutching the knife. Daniel rushed downstairs, finding me pale and shaking. "What happened?" he demanded. I couldn't explain. The next morning, Walter appeared as I was fixing the lock. He stood on the edge of our driveway, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. "You shouldn't lock your doors," he said, his voice calm but firm. I didn't respond. Walter stepped closer. "Hospitality is the cornerstone of our community. Locked doors ruin that." I ignored him, focusing on the new lock. Walter sighed. "Just remember, some doors are meant to stay open." That evening, a pie appeared on our porch. A note was tucked beneath it, written in neat cursive. "For the guests of Daniel and Rachel. We apologize for any discomfort. Remember, hospitality is key." I didn't touch it. Something about the note felt like a warning. That night, the slamming returned. But this time, it wasn't just the door. Windows shattered one by one. Long, spider-like limbs reached through the broken panes, their jagged nails scraping against the walls. Daniel and I barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, but the sound of splintering wood told us the front door had been breached. We clung to each other, whispering prayers. Then silence. When morning came, the house was a wreck. Every window broken, the door hanging off its hinges. The pie was gone. We never locked our doors again. Days after the chaos, Daniel and I fell into a strange rhythm. We stopped trying to make sense of what had happened. There was no explaining it, no rationalizing the images that still haunted me every time I closed my eyes. We told ourselves it was easier to move forward, to blend in, to survive. Hollow Pine wasn't just a town. It was something different. And it demanded something from us that we didn't fully understand. The mornings felt deceptively normal. The neighborhood carried on like nothing had happened. Walter and Mabel waved from their porch. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the crisp autumn air. Children played hopscotch on the cracked sidewalks, their laughter punctuated by the sound of distant wind chimes. But at night, the weight of unseen eyes pressed against our home, a constant reminder of the unspoken rules we had stumbled into. It was a week later when Walter knocked on our door again. I hesitated before answering, my hand hovering over the knob. When I opened it, he stood there with his familiar hat and coat, holding a tin tray covered with a checkered cloth. "Good evening, Rachel," he said, his voice steady. "Thought I'd bring over some of Mabel's peach cobbler. It's her specialty." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "You didn't eat the pie, did you?" Walter's question was casual, but his tone was laced with something darker. "No," I admitted. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment his eyes softened. "I understand. You're new here. But next time, you'll need to." I swallowed hard. "Next time?" Walter placed the tray on the porch railing. "Every home here has guests. They come and go. It's our job to be good hosts. It's how we keep the peace." "What are they?" I blurted out, my voice trembling. Walter didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his hat, his gaze drifting to the dense pines at the edge of the street. "They've been here longer than us, longer than the town. We owe them respect, and if we don't..." He looked back at me, his expression grim. "Then they'll take what they're owed." I closed the door before he could say anything else. Daniel found me in the kitchen, staring at the untouched cobbler. What did he say? Nothing that makes sense, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, the air felt heavier, charged with something electric. Daniel and I sat on the couch, the silence between us thick and unyielding. Around midnight, the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside. I tensed, my ears straining to catch every detail. Daniel squeezed my hand. Let's go to bed. Reluctantly, I followed him upstairs. But sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, my thoughts racing. Just after 2 a.m., the door creaked. This time, there was no hesitation. The handle turned with deliberate slowness, and the door swung open. From our bedroom window, I saw them. Shapes, distorted and fluid, moved through the darkness. They didn't walk so much as glide, their bodies bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. Daniel stirred beside me. Rachel, he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I see them, I replied. One of the figures stopped just beyond the doorway, its face obscured by shadow. Its long skeletal arm reached out, and for a moment, I thought it would step inside, but instead it gestured, a slow, deliberate motion, as if beckoning us. We have to stay here, I whispered, gripping Daniel's arm. But the sound of glass shattering downstairs shattered my resolve. They're inside, Daniel said, his voice shaking. The next moments were a blur. The house was alive with movement, whispers, the scrape of nails on walls, the sound of furniture being overturned. The air was thick with a metallic tang that made it hard to breathe. Daniel grabbed my hand. We need to run. Where? Anywhere but here. We bolted for the window, but as Daniel tried to pry it open, one of the shapes loomed behind him. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, fingers curling around the frame. I screamed, and the thing hesitated, its eyeless face turning toward me. In that instant, Daniel shoved the window open and pushed me through. Go, he shouted. I fell, hitting the ground hard. When I looked up, Daniel was still at the window, struggling to climb out. But the creature was faster. Its hand shot out, wrapping around his ankle. Daniel! I screamed, scrambling to my feet. The thing yanked him back with inhuman strength, and the last thing I saw was his terrified face disappearing into the darkness. I ran. The pines swallowed me, their twisted branches clawing at my skin. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The sound of the creature's pursuit faded, replaced by the rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat. When I finally stopped, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The town was silent, the lights of our house barely visible through the dense foliage. The dawn brought no relief. Hollow Pine stood as it always had, serene, untouched, and indifferent to what had happened. My body ached from the fall, my legs weak from running. I staggered back toward the house, dread pooling in my stomach. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, the shattered windows yawning like empty sockets. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. My voice cracked as I called for Daniel, but the only response was my echo bouncing off the walls. The living room was a wreck. Furniture lay overturned. Deep gashes clawed into the hardwood floors. But the worst part was the table. The peach cobbler Walter had left was gone, its tray scraped clean. A small note lay in its place. For the guests of Hollow Pine, your hospitality was noted. We'll return when the time is right. I sank into a chair, clutching the note, my mind spiraling. They had taken him, and somehow this was my fault. Walter appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, his silhouette framed by the fractured sunlight filtering through the trees. They don't usually take two, he said, his tone almost apologetic. What did you do? I demanded, my voice raw. It's not about what we do, Walter replied. It's about what we owe. You let them take him, I shouted, my hands trembling. He sighed, stepping inside. This town survives because we follow the rules. Every home here has a role to play. Every family has a debt to pay. It's been that way for generations. What kind of debt? Walter's gaze hardened. The kind you inherit. You bought this house, didn't you? That means it's yours now, responsibilities and all. I wanted to scream, to hit him, but the weight of his words crushed me. I didn't agree to this. You didn't have to, Walter said. The house chose you. I stared at him, my chest tight. How do I get him back? Walter shook his head. You don't. Not unless they bring him back. Why would they do that? He hesitated. Sometimes they return what they take, if they're satisfied. I grabbed the note from the table, holding it up. Satisfied with what? This? Walter's expression softened, almost pitying. With you. The following days passed in a blur. I stopped leaving the house, afraid I'd miss something. A sign, a sound, anything that might tell me Daniel was alive. The neighbors avoided me. Their once friendly waves replaced with hurried glances and muttered apologies. Even Walter kept his distance. At night, the whispers returned. Faint, just beyond the edge of hearing. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, always slipping away when I turned to look. On the 7th night, I heard the front door creak open. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The air felt heavy, charged with static. I forced myself to move, inching toward the staircase. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's behavior grew stranger. He hardly spoke, spending hours staring out the window or pacing the house. At night, I'd wake to find him standing by the front door, his hand on the knob. Daniel, I'd whisper. What are you doing? Waiting, he'd reply, his voice flat. For what? His gaze would drift to the forest. Them. One night I found him sitting at the dining table, a single candle casting flickering shadows across his face. The peach cobbler tray sat in front of him, clean and empty. I need to prepare, he said, not looking up. For what? His fingers drummed against the table. They're coming back. Panic tightened my chest. Why? We've done everything they asked. Daniel's head tilted, his dark eyes locking onto mine. Not everything. The candle flickered, and for a moment his shadow stretched unnaturally across the walls, its shape jagged and inhuman. I stepped back, my heart racing. You're not him, I whispered. He stood, the candlelight distorting his features. You brought me back, he said, his voice a low growl. But you don't get to keep me. The lights in the house flickered, and the whispers returned, louder this time. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, growing darker, denser. Daniel, I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. Please, fight this. His expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the man I loved. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't have a choice. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him. I screamed, reaching for him, but he was gone. The darkness swallowed him whole, leaving me alone in the flickering candlelight. The next morning, Walter stood on my porch holding another note. It's not over, he said, his voice grave. I unfolded the paper, my hands shaking. Hospitality is eternal. Prepare your home. Your guests will return. I looked up at Walter, my eyes burning with tears. How do I stop this? He sighed, his shoulders slumping. You don't. And with that he walked away, leaving me to face the haunting reality of Hollow Pine alone.